ICS, and thank you for joining us today. So my name is Noor Shahada Jamil. I am a senior lecturer at the ICS, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's session. So the theme of our forum today is to change, compete, or coexist. U.S.-China relations under the Bush administration. Since the Bush administration. And it's really our honor to have Professor Paul Haenle here today with us as our speaker. But before we begin, please allow me to just take a few minutes of your time to just briefly introduce our speaker for today. Professor Haenle currently holds the Maurice R. Greenberg Directors Chair at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also a visiting senior research fellow at the East Asian Institute at US National University of Singapore. And I think it is really worth highlighting that Professor Haenle, prior to joining Carnegie, he used to serve with the White House China Director as the White House China Director on the National Security Council under two former presidents, President George W. Bush and also Barack Obama. So without further ado, shall we now invite Professor Haenle to deliver his speech. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to everyone here. Thank you to our viewers on the video there. And especially thank you to the Institute of China Studies for inviting me here. Dr. Miao Chaoping, thank you very much, the director. Professor Hu Chaoping as well. And thank you, Shahada, for a kind introduction. And it's good to see my friend Kwek Chung Chui as well in the audience. And nice to have lunch with him before I came over. I look forward to talking to you today about U.S.-China relations and sort of evolution of U.S.-China relations. I do a podcast called China in the World, and I just recently did one with a scholar that many of you know, Charmaine Willoughby in the Philippines, and she walked through over several administrations kind of the Philippines policy and approach to China. And I thought I would do the same here with looking at the United States approach to China. And I am traveling back to Washington, D.C. Week after next, because I was part of a very interesting book project run by the former national security advisors to President Bush, Maurice R and Steve Hadley, working closely with President Bush. And those of us that worked in the White House National Security Council on these issues. And at the end of the administration, going from President Bush to President Obama, from the Republican Party to the Democratic, President Bush wanted those of us in the National Security Council to write policy memos for the Obama administration, detailing how we saw the issues that we worked on when we came into the Bush administration, what policies we put in place, what we thought went well, and where we thought still needed work. And we were to hand these memos over to the incoming Obama administration. Now you can understand politically that could present some problems because the Obama administration could then use these memos later to say, look, we know why the policy was so bad because we see the analysis that they used in the Bush administration. But President Bush didn't care about that. He very much wanted a smooth transition, especially on foreign policy and national security issues. So we wrote these memos. I was involved in the China memo, and I was involved in the North Korea memo. They have been declassified, and they're in this book called Handoff, which is technically not out yet. It is being launched February 23rd in Washington, D.C. And I brought an advanced copy here to present to the Institute of China Studies because I was the lead author for the China chapter. And I thought maybe you would find that of some interest to understand at least how the Bush administration saw China when it came into office. I wrote here with a couple of colleagues what's called the postscript, which is looking back now 14 years since the Bush administration left office. Through that lens, how do we now evaluate the policy that we put in place? And so in the book, if you go to the China section, you'll see the actual memorandums that were presented to the Obama administration in 2008, 2009. along with a postscript chapter, bringing it up to the current situation. And what I thought I would do in my talk today is kind of walk through some of that as well, so you have an idea of at least how we saw it. A lot has changed in U.S.-China relations since I worked on it in the National Security Council between 2004 and 2009. At the beginning of the Bush administration, there was always a range of issues, as you know. I know in Malaysia there's a range of issues on China. There was a debate early on in the Bush administration, the White House Situation Room, all of the departments and agencies represented. Some pointed to China's rising power and recommended that the U.S. adopt a policy framework mostly to blunt China's rise, prevent or head off the potential challenge. There were clearly frictions in the U.S.-China relationship. You remember in the early days of the Bush administration, the EP-3 incident where our plane collided with a Chinese plane, crash landed in Haenle Island. But containing China's rise was not where President Bush came out in terms of his policy framework for China. Instead, the main push of the Bush administration in dealing with the rise of China was instead to encourage China to play a responsible role in Asia and the world, while building an architecture of alliances, partnerships, and institutions in the region that would be beneficial to a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. The administration's opening assumptions on China was that it presented both opportunities as well as challenges. You might remember that President Bush, when he was campaigning for president, was the first president that called destabilize the region and harm the interests of the U.S. and partners and allies. And for this reason, the Bush administration pursued a strategy of engagement, but also backed that up by balancing and hedging. And the purpose of the engagement, of course, was to support China's integration into the regional, international, political, and economic architecture, encourage it to play a supportive and constructive role, rather than overturn the architecture that had been in place for decades and that had contributed to peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Many in China and the international community had sound reasons to expect that China would continue along a path of economic reform and political liberalization. Strategic dialogue mechanisms that were put in place by the Bush administration were used for the purpose of China of pushing for China's continued path of economic and political reform. These efforts had been pursued by previous leaders. Some of them are on the wall here, including Deng Xiaoping and Zhu Rongji, the former premier. In other words, the engagement that the Bush administration undertook was not premised on an assumption of the inevitability of the liberalization of China, but it was done to encourage and to push and to respond to some of the voices in China that were calling for greater reform and opening. At the time, the Bush administration pursued robust engagement. It also recognized, as it does today, that there are potential challenges and risks. And to deal with those risks, the Bush administration moved to strengthen the alliances and the partnerships in the region that could be galvanized to help shape choices that China makes, but also be necessary should future leaders in China choose a different path, as many at the time thought that was possible, and then I think many in the United States right now, in my own country, think that is the current case under the current leadership. Now, a key question to ask that is asked in the U.S. policy debate, and when we wrote this book, we had to think about that question and make sure that we dealt with it. Was the Bush administration naive about the evolution that China would undertake? Some argue that in hindsight, that the Bush administration was naive in trying to effectively engage with China. That the Bush administration was naive to try to build constructive relationship with China, to try to enhance cooperation with China, and to support China's integration into the regional and international systems after decades of isolation. Frankly, I think it was reasonable and in U.S. interest for the Bush administration to do that. We were clear-eyed that the effort could fail. We understood at the end of the day, China is a very different system than the United States. Marxist-Leninist system is very different than a U.S.-style democracy. So to prepare for the risks, again, we worked hard to strengthen these alliance relationships and our presence in the region. Many in the U.S. have now believed that the risks at the time that were highlighted have borne out themselves, especially under the current leadership. There's a strong view in the United States, and I'm very interested to hear perspectives here of experts and scholars in Malaysia. But there's a strong view that the China we're witnessing today is very different, frankly, than China that we dealt with in the Bush administration, and certainly when the Bush administration came into office in 2001. But there's also another good reason why I think it was worth trying. You know, if the Bush administration had not tried to engage China, to welcome China's rise, to help foster its integration into the World Trade Organization and things like this, if we had immediately moved to an effort to kind of thwart China's rise, seeing it more of a threat than an opportunity, and build a hostile approach, we could be criticized today for being the reason that China has become more aggressive abroad and more repressive at home. And this is a similar argument that you hear today when you hear people talk about U.S. policy toward Russia, that it was the U.S. that has driven Putin's aggression to invade Georgia and Ukraine because of efforts to enlarge NATO, to develop missile defense, basically to move to a more confrontation policy toward Russia, and that this is driven. I don't believe that argument, but I think it's harder to make that argument given where the Bush administration started with China, really trying to embrace the opportunities and thinking about the risks and hedging and balancing against those risks. So again, I think the engagement with China was not premised on the inevitability that China would converge with political and economic systems of the West. Was there a hope that those trends would continue? Certainly, but never thought it was inevitable. And as a result, you saw this policy of engaging, but yet hedging and balancing. Now, what has happened since the end of the Bush administration? So I left the White House in 2009, and I spent 10 years living in Beijing, China, running the Carnegie Center, and building the center in a way to continue some of the work to build constructive relations with China, to enhance cooperation on a range of issues. The global landscape over that period of time from 2010 to 2023 has shifted dramatically. I think it's all safe to say that we recognize that. And in a sense, I would argue that so too has China's own view of itself, China's view of the United States, and China's view of the world. My own sense is that the global financial crisis at the end of the Bush administration, 2008, late 2008, in the eyes of senior Chinese leaders, damaged the credibility of the U.S. economic model. In a sense, I think China looked to the U.S. model in some ways prior to the global financial crisis as a fairly superior model in a sense, and striving efforts to economic reform were, I think, in many ways premised on achieving some of those same arrangements. On the political side, and China has watched populism spread across Western countries, Europe, but also, of course, the United States. And I think these developments, both on the economic side, political side, in the United States, have sown real doubt in Beijing about the primacy and the efficacy of Western-style democracy. And as a result, we see a view now in China, and you hear it among Chinese experts, that the US and the West may be in decline. And we see a more confident China, more confident in its own political and economic systems, despite the challenges. And some China assessment that the long-term trends may be turning in China's favor. So this is quite a different assessment, I think, from 2008 until now. Now, there's been changes to China's policies and approaches. Western economic and political challenges have also coincided, I would argue, with a period of rising Chinese ambition and nationalism. Most would agree that the changes we've seen under the current leadership are quite striking. We've seen a centralization of Chinese Communist Party control in a way that we haven't seen, frankly, since the time of this leader over here, Mao Zedong. This current leadership has reasserted the role of the party in virtually every element of Chinese society. And on the domestic front, China's grip on public discourse has tightened considerably, and US has concerns over human rights issues as well. China has ramped up assertive actions on its periphery, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, has adopted a sophisticated toolbox of coercive measures often used to punish countries in the region or express Chinese displeasure when unhappy about certain policies that countries take or certain actions or statements. We've seen that with Australia. We're calling for an international investigation into the origins of COVID. Korea, they wanted to pursue the theater of missile defense. Philippines, restrictions on banana exports. We see this toolbox sharpening over time. Much stronger assertions of Chinese claims in the South China Sea as well. And the foreign policy dictum that I know folks in this room under Deng Xiaoping have heard, Tao Guangyang Hui, is really a thing of the past. That is really a thing of the past. And it's been discarded for an international strategy in favor of a more aggressive foreign policy with the stated goal of China's leading the reform of the global governance system. And even Chinese scholars that I engaged with in Beijing when I was living there, in terms of the shift away from the low-profile international strategy, said that yes, it's probably time for China to modify this, but not at the speed and the scale with which China has done that. Creates significant anxieties in the region and in the international community. And we've seen a number of reassessments from countries about China and the potential threats. Now, let me just say a little bit about what happened after the Bush administration going into the Obama administration. Chinese policies and postures have evolved, but so too have the policies of the subsequent presidential administrations after the Bush administration. In fact, I was asked to stay in the Obama administration at the end of 4.5 years in Bush. And the foreign policy team that came in, I was a lieutenant colonel in the military. I was not a political appointee. So going from the Republican administration to Democrat was not a problem for me because I was not a political appointee. And what the foreign policies of advisors of the Obama administration said was, we actually think the Bush administration did a pretty good job on China. We want to build on the framework that was put in place. So you can see the continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And the fact that I was able to stay and do the same job demonstrates that. So the Obama administration put policies in place, I would argue, that expanded on Bush administration's economic and security building blocks in the region. The Obama administration went even further in putting much more emphasis on Southeast Asia. That was something that they wanted to do, and I think that was very clear. U.S. commitments in the Middle East began to decrease, and the Obama administration announced this pivot to Asia. That ultimately enhanced the efforts that I mentioned in the Bush administration, where we're strengthening partnerships and key alliances. The Obama administration built on those efforts. The main economic component of the strategy was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was, I would argue, built on the Bush administration efforts to develop rules and standards on trade as part of a Trans-Pacific Trading Pact. The redeployment of military assets to the Asia Pacific carried on efforts championed by the Bush administration to strengthen security partnerships in the region. Where it was in U.S. interest, the Obama administration also sought to emphasize cooperative aspects of U.S.-China relationship and achieved some success, I would argue, on the issue of climate change, which ultimately culminated in the Paris Accords. So while there was some effective cooperation, it was also clear at the time that Beijing, that China would started to pursue policies that increasingly undermined U.S. interests. And that led to serious concerns in the Obama administration. Policymakers began to reevaluate the efficacy of a U.S. policy toward China that was predicated on engagement. So several presidential administrations have pursued engagement. At the end of the Obama administration, I think there was beginnings of an assessment about the continued efficacy of that approach. And that especially became apparent following China's failures to adhere to cybersecurity agreements, failing to adhere to commitments not to militarize the islands in the South China Sea. And so we saw the beginnings, I think, at the end of the Obama administration, of a tougher approach to China. And then entered the Trump administration. Okay? And frustrations that emerged in the Obama administration were then carried into the Trump administration. Very quickly, Trump administration, Donald Trump was elected as a disruptor in U.S. politics, and he carried out policies that created significant. I probably need this for the virtual. So yeah, Donald Trump was elected as a disruptor, and he carried out policies, including foreign policies, that created significant disruption. And very quickly, he decided to reject the policies and the approaches of all of his predecessors, Obama, Bush, Clinton, even before that, on China. So the Trump administration criticized U.S. policy of engagement, accusing Bush and Obama administration of being naive, and instead implemented a set of much more confrontational policies targeting areas where I believe Chinese behavior undermined U.S. interests. At the same time, the Trump administration, unfortunately, abandoned key regional multilateral efforts that the Bush and Obama administrations have developed.
Battery is enough. Please recharge in time.
President Trump, I guess it's telling me that I'm low on energy. Yeah, recharge the bilateral relations, please. President Trump withdrew from TPP, which was originally designed to create a regional trade regime that would encourage China to accept higher standards and practices. The Trump administration preferred to deal with China and other countries in the region on a bilateral basis. In my view, failed to recognize the importance of partnerships and alliances. These approaches, in my view, were very unfortunate. I think they're short-sighted in many ways and self-defeating, frankly, for the U.S. Where I would give the Trump administration some credit is they broke important new ground by emphasizing China's role as a strategic competitor. Back to President Bush in the campaign.
Please recharge in time.
When he talked about China as a strategic competitor, and also by putting a spotlight on some worrying trends coming out of China. But those important efforts, I think, were also undercut by threats to withdraw U.S. troops from the region, unilateral trade policies, and a near total retreat from the region's multilateral diplomacy, especially here in Southeast Asia. And that brings me to the Biden administration. When Biden came into office a little over 2 years ago, it accepted the Trump administration's framing of strategic competition. It also accepted much of the assessment in terms of the challenges that are posed by China. But where it differed from the Trump administration is on the question of how to deal with China, how to deal with these challenges. The Biden administration wanted, 2 years ago, to craft a less ad hoc and a more effective and strategic approach to competing with China. They responded to the changes that I mentioned in China's foreign and domestic policy, primarily by investing in domestic renewal and by working closer with partners and allies around the world. And I don't think that we can debate this. I don't think the overall policy of the Biden administration is to contain China. Maybe in some areas, certainly we can talk about those. But I think, again, it is to support the international institutions and norms that from a U.S. perspective, there's a view that they generally contribute to rising peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and across the world. Norms on things like rule of law, free and fair trade, peaceful resolution of disputes, universal human rights, freedom of navigation. Secretary of State Blinken said in his China speech in May of last year that he indicated the U.S. isn't looking to try to change China as maybe previous administrations have, but rather in his words, we cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So there's an acceptance that Beijing is going to move along the path that it has decided is best for itself. So the administration will work to shape the strategic environment around China to advance a vision for an open and inclusive international system. You've heard the phrase invest, align, and compete. Try to invest in American competitiveness, work closely with allies and partners, rejoin international institutions that the Trump administration left, and form new coalitions like AUKUS, CHIPS 4, US-EU Trade and Technology Council, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now what you hear is a desire to put a floor under the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, to build guardrails, and to find ways to build cooperation. So let me just advance forward to where does that leave us today, and what do we do about it? It's not going to be easy, I think, to put the U.S.-China relationship on a more constructive and more stable footing. There are real structural challenges, and I'm trying to lay out here in my talk. I do expect a period of fairly difficult relations for some time, but I think there are some smart things that the U.S. Administration can do. Number one, we do not believe that strategic competition should preclude cooperation. There are many issues where the U.S. and China do not see eye to eye, and that list seems to be getting longer and longer. But there's also many areas where we do have common interest, many of the global issues. I think it would benefit both sides to try to work together on things like climate change and global health, non-proliferation, and other transnational issues. That kind of cooperation has been difficult to achieve. I think it largely is because of different views in the US and in China on the conditions that are necessary for that cooperation. Right now, we hear a lot. In fact, when John Kerry went to China last year, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, then insisted that China-US cooperation on climate change cannot be divorced from the overall situation of the US and China. What he means by that is, if the US doesn't sort of have a friendlier approach to China, then China will find it hard to cooperate, even on issues where there's common interest or that could be seen as contributing to international public goods. I think the US has a very different view on that. Second, and I'll just mention three altogether. Second is I think that I think there would be a benefit for the US and China to try to find a problem-solving mode, a more effective emphasis for putting the relationship on better footing. If the two leaders commit to establishing this problem-solving mode, rather than trying to place all efforts on developing, very ambitious sets of cooperation. I do think we should pursue cooperation, but we need to be realistic in this. But we can engage in problem solving. Compromising on each side doesn't mean that each country has to abandon their key national interests, but it will require each side to be more proactive and kind of roll up their sleeves and tackle fundamental issues in the relationship. For issues like this, I'm referring to more like key irritants in the relationship, restrictions on people-to-people exchanges, reciprocal consulate closures that we've seen, those reopen. In a sense, just achieving progress at a smaller scale that over time builds a foundation that allows over time to lead to negotiations on more fundamental structural issues like trade and technology, which I think today in the current environment are very difficult to address. Lastly, I think the US and China have begun talking about this, need to, despite all the differences in relationship challenges, begin to develop principles and operating mechanisms for managing the US-China relationship. China is not going anywhere, and the US is not going anywhere. Going to have to, as some say, find a way to coexist. And so I think building on this framework of principles and operating mechanisms will be important. But to do that, you have to have frank, high-level conversation between our two governments. It's very unfortunate. This balloon incident led to the cancellation of Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China, because coming out of the Biden-Xi meeting in Bali, I think there was a real effort by both sides to sustain the high-level dialogue and to use that to try to put a floor on the deterioration of the relations and to build a more stable footing for US and China in a period of very difficult relations. So with that, I've talked way too long, and I'd be much more interested in hearing your perspectives and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Haenle, for your very insightful and also interesting talk. So shall we now invite Dr. Niao Chaobing, the Director of Institute of China Studies, ICS, to offer some of his observations and also comment about the topic. Dr. Niao, please.
Thank you very much, Paul. It was a very insightful talk covering your experience in the Bush administration and also certain of your personal experience in Beijing, and also combining all this with your analysis about the evolution of American government's views and policies towards China under different presidents. And I think you went through the period when engagement was still the mainstream, was still the hopeful sign, where you still believe that it was the right approach, to now that basically strategic competition is the main theme. It was really I look forward to reading your chapter about that, about these changes. I think I would just basically speak from Southeast Asia's views and perspectives in a way. And of course, Southeast Asia is very, very diverse. 10 countries, 10 views, and perhaps I would say 10 multiplied views, because each country also have a variety of views how to deal and engage with the rising China. And from Southeast Asia, I think, of course, the sense of the presence of China is really, really there. I think for the past 10 years, everybody can see, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, suddenly there are a lot of companies with from China with, suddenly just coming up here and there. And for the past more than 15 years already, Malaysia, China was the largest trade partner with Malaysia, and then we see a lot of this socio-economic exchanges and so on and so forth. And Southeast Asia would generally still see engagement as the main way to deal with China. Of course, we are not big powers. We are somewhat coming from a very different starting point compared to the United States. But for us, this me speaking, of course, I'm sure there are others who will have a different views. Strategic competition is really not an option at the moment. Of course, we have differences with China, and some of them are very sharp, and we have to be very prepared for more hegemonic China. But by and large, there is no other option other than bringing China into a more inclusive order in the region. I think Malaysia in particular, somehow by fortune or somehow by strategic insight or whatever, was actually a pioneering country in that sense. With the pictures on the wall where you saw where our second prime minister visiting China in May 1974, it was actually a pioneering move in the sense that in 74, none of the ASEAN countries, original ASEAN 5, had diplomatic relations with China. We were still very much in the Cold War mode versus communism versus anti-communism and things like that. But Malaysia's decision to establish diplomatic ties with China changed ASEAN, as the host ASEAN perspective in a way, at least toward a more neutral and non-alignment kind of path from a very anti-communist bloc to a more neutral bloc. That was the first pioneering move made by Malaysia in that sense. The other one is 1991, when the Cold War just ended, and China also, after the Tiananmen isolation and all this, all these developments, and they looked around ASEAN and trying to re-establish a footing with ASEAN, and it was Malaysia that invited China to establish a dialogue partnership, dialogue relations, and develop a dialogue partnership with ASEAN. And that again is another another move in terms of trying to engage and integrate. And of course, the China that we're talking about, Southeast Asia, also feel the very same. Today's China is very different from those days China. But somehow I think, and I believe still the majority view within the region is that we should not abandon engagement. And one good example, again, I would just cite Malaysia, whereas other countries have other views, was that when China ran into one of the most difficult periods in 2018, when we had a new government after the long dominant government was finally voted out of office. But the new government, I wouldn't say the new government was anti-China in a way, but had a very skeptical view about some of the key Belt and Road projects that have been negotiated. And it would be very easy for that government during that time to bandwagon the debt trap diplomacy, the kind of rhetoric and it would basically receive, I suppose, with a lot more Western support at the time, because relation was already quite bad between China and the West. For Malaysia to bandwagon of this so-called anti-China bashing at the time, but we chose actually not to. We disagree with China. We found that the deal had a lot of problems that were detrimental to our national interests, but we refused to demonize China in a way. We just try to settle the issue professionally and that's it and move on. Because I think the approach is that it was counterproductive to refuse engagement and then just to put a label towards China that you are exporting that trend and things like that. Even if it is true, it is not the right approach to actually. I think the government it's not the right approach to deal with this kind of problem, because once you fixate a label towards a country, your policy will begin from that label, and that label had a tendency to fix your thinking, and your policies will become more and more reflective of that label, and the reactions from China will be basically based on that label. And in a way, that is what people call self-fulfilling prophecy. I think the sense is that Southeast Asia, acknowledging that there are many difficulties in the relationship with China, refuse to go to that fixation, that the future is still far from being determined. So that will be how I think Southeast Asia look at relations with China, and also in watching warily in a way the developments between US and China. It is the development that I think many Southeast Asian governments, decision makers even business sectors that are watching with serious concerns that the way that relationship is developing. And I hope that both sides would not actually fixate label on each other. That China would not fixate upon that the US is a hegemon on power, no ban on containing China. Whereas the US also wouldn't always fixate upon that this is like the way that Soviet Union was used to being described as an evil empire and things like that. That is that the future is actually far from being determined. So I hope that this will be some constructive views from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Neo, for offering us a Southeast Asian perspective on US-China relations and also how Southeast Asian countries would prefer to deal with China. Right? So we will now open the floor for Q&A. So if you have any questions, comment, or suggestion, you may raise your hand and then just briefly introduce yourself and introduce our speakers to respond to your question on behalf. And because this is a hybrid event, so we are having some friends joining us remotely through Zoom meeting. So for those who are joining us remotely, you may also raise your hand and also type a question in the chat box, and then we will address it. So shall we invite the first question from the floor? Yes.
Thank you, James Wong, and David Manbrock, the Carnegie Association, former MP. As we all know, the first Cold War lasted about 45 years. US and the Soviet Union, and ended with the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So this one, I don't know whether you can call it Cold War II or strategic competition. I think it's basically the same nature of competition. Or maybe with more areas, involving more areas than the Soviet Union. So how long would this strategic competition between US and China last? And how would it end? Do you think China will disintegrate like the Soviet Union? Or what the other? I don't know. There's no end to it, seems. Thank you.
And maybe we should collect another question on the floor first, before we ask Professor Haenle to address it. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mahmoud Ali. I've been studying US-China relations since about October 1986. In that period, I've not met one American official who has not only been a senior White House person and then gone on to spend so many years in Beijing. So I'll take this opportunity to ask you 3 questions. The first one is about process. Who actually makes China policy within the National Security Council? Is it General McMaster in President Trump's case, or is it President Trump himself giving out views? For example, I know in the Nixon administration, President Nixon wrote to Henry Kissinger and also rang him up and called him and talked about opening bridges to China within 1 week of coming to office. But that was Nixon. So I wonder, in your experience in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, who made the China policy? Was it an interagency process? Was it a presidential sort of NSDM kind of thing? Number one. Secondly, you were in the government then, in the White House. In November 2009, President Obama went to Beijing. And in many Western news platforms, we read the report that Obama receives full reception in Beijing. I mean, what was that about? Was it cool because he had to get down using a smaller ladder from his aircraft? Air Force One? Was it the way he was treated by his hosts? Was there something that he was lectured? Because that word is also used. A Chinese official lectured him about the economy of one of those things. So it would really help to understand whether President Obama's encounter with his hosts in 2009 actually made something different happen. I remember there was a report in People's Daily, but not in the American press, that Premier Wen Jiabao curtly rejected any notion of the G2, the Brzezinski concept. Was that a proposal from the administration to the Chinese leadership, and was it rejected? Was it just Wen Jiabao responding to a question. And thirdly, it's about your personal experience. I mean, you have met a lot of Chinese scholars and officials in those 10 years. What is your impression of the role of history or the impact, historical experience of China's encounter with the West, or more powerful countries like Japan? Has that really made an impression on the way policies are thought of and choices are made? Thank you.
Okay, so I think you have a total of four questions to answer. So yeah, let's do this one by one. So the first one would be from our friend Mr. James. So the question is about whether or not this is like Cold War 2.0, and then how long will this strategic competition last? And then we have from Dr. Mahmoud three different questions. Right? The first one is like, who actually make China foreign policy in the National Security Council of the US? And then why, when Obama visited in 2009, and then you received this full reception. And the last one is the role of historical factors in Chinese foreign policy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to get to Jane, Mr. Wong, and Mr. Ali's very early questions. I want to back up a little bit. I want to respond to what Charlie said. And I recognize, I've been in China, say 10 years after I left the White House. I've been in Singapore now for a little over a year. I'm realizing that there's a variety of views in Southeast Asia. That is very apparent to me. I'm learning that. And I'm enjoying that. And I think it's very important for Americans to understand the differences. I think actually we can learn quite a bit from understanding perspectives of the region. As you said, being here so close to China, there's a real sense, feel China, right? And it's much more real in a sense. The Chinese companies you mentioned, social economic connection. And that Southeast Asia sees in general engagement as a way to deal with China. And I want to clarify a little bit to make sure that I was not misunderstood. I actually believe engagement is important. I have lived in Beijing for 10 years, brought my family there. My wife was 6 months pregnant and moved to China. If I didn't think engagement was important, I think it's very important. It is, I think, a part of what the Biden administration is trying to do. But I think we're at a point in the U.S. where looking at China, we don't think it could be sort of the entirety of the approach, not the engagement. And it's very interesting at the end of the Obama administration, because there was a debate about what to do, because China was asserting much more forcefully its territorial claims in the South China Sea. The State Department and the White House were putting out all sorts of statements. It didn't seem to matter at all. China just continued to press ahead. Hundreds of billions of dollars of cyber theft of U.S. intellectual property, a real inability to address real concerns about the way China's economy engages with the global economy and creates an unfair playing field. Chinese companies have huge subsidies from the Chinese government, which allows these companies to go out and compete. And private companies that don't get that kind of support were having difficulties competing with China. Right? The Obama administration is struggling with these issues, and they're starting to form a debate. Right? Because the goal of, in a sense, the goal of U.S. policy up to that point had been, how do we achieve a stable relationship with no friction? There's a debate again, which at the end of the Obama administration said, you know what? If we're going to defend U.S. interests, if we're going to advance U.S. interests, we may actually have to be tolerant of friction in the U.S.-China relationship. We may have to accept that when we push back on China, it may create some instability. It may create some friction. Chinese may not like it. That was controversial at the end of the Obama administration. Right? So you can see there's an evolution in thinking. that, and I don't think we've abandoned engagement altogether, the Trump administration in a sense, but I think the Biden team wants to cooperate. You can see they're engaging at high levels. But I think now there's an acceptance that because of the China that we see today, much more assertive, much more aggressive in pursuing its own interests and preferences, that if we're going to safeguard our own, we've got to be tough. And I think that's the change that we've gone through. It's not an abandonment of engagement as a tactic within a broader set of policies. Strategic competition, my critique, unfortunately, of that is it describes a state, a condition. It's not a policy. And I think that's where I think Mr. Wong asked the question that I think the Biden administration has not articulated. Where are we trying to get to? What is the ultimate goal here? What is the stable equilibrium with China that we in the United States and our friends and allies and partners around the world can accept? And so I think we're not quite there yet. And you know, there are aspects of it that are Cold War-like. I agree with you. You know, certainly now on the technology side, in the semiconductor space, Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell in the White House, they wrote an article before they entered the Biden administration and said, when we deal with China, we should spend more time figuring out how the United States can run faster itself, as opposed to always trying to slow down China. I think in a number of areas now they're trying to do both, right? They're trying to increase American competitiveness, but they're also trying to slow China down where there are national security concerns. And the semiconductors and other aspects of technology are examples of that. The one difference in terms of the Cold War analogy of the Soviet Union, of course, is our economic engagement, trading. The trade over the last year has actually gone on between the US and China. How is that possible? That's not a feature of a Cold War. So you have elements of it that don't seem like a Cold War, and we have US multinational companies. I mean, I talk to CEOs all the time that, sure, they're thinking about, well, if I, need to build additional supply chains, maybe I should look elsewhere. But the supply chains they have in China, they would prefer to keep there because it's hard to move supply chains. So that's not really Cold War like. US companies in China are still trying to do business, right? So it's much more complicated, I think, and it's hard to know how long this will go on for. I don't even think I could begin to answer that question, but I hope I've addressed a couple aspects of it. And then Mr. Ali, you've asked some terrific questions. Thank you very much for your questions. It's interesting, you talked about, who makes China policy. You mentioned McMaster and Trump. That was one dynamic. I can talk about that. You mentioned Henry Kissinger. That was a whole different dynamic, right? In a sense, Henry Kissinger, as an individual, did a lot of policy making himself, even President Nixon. Yep. You remember President Henry Kissinger was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor at one point in time. In the Bush administration, and I can talk more about that. I think that on the issue of China, because as I mentioned in the beginning of the Bush administration, there was a pretty vigorous debate of what to do about China. And we had the EP-3 incident where a Chinese fighter craft collided with the EP-3. We saw that as a hostile move. Unfortunately, the Chinese pilot died, and the crew landed in Haenle Island, and we got them back 10 days later, and we got the aircraft back in 100 boxes broken up into small pieces. But nevertheless, we managed to work through the crisis. President Bush also said in April 2001, 3 months after the office, in response to a question, we will do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan. That was also a difficult point in US-China early on in the Bush administration. there were voices calling for a much tougher approach to China. In that administration, I would argue a couple of things happened. One is 9/11. And President Bush, in a sense, became very focused on making sure that a terrorist attack like that did not happen in the United States during his time in office. And that became a real priority for him. And that allowed the U.S.-China relationship kind of to get on a better track. Don't want to take on too many challenges all at the same time. But I was in the Pentagon in 2003, and I remember I was working on China. And a senior general officer came up to me and said, glad to see you working on China here. He said, don't take your eye off the ball, because over the long term, China is our biggest strategic. We have the aftermath of 9/11 to deal with now, but when we're beyond that, China will be back in the picture. I thought that was very clairvoyant in a sense. But the other factor in determining policy toward China was President Bush himself. And President Bush, his father, had been ambassador in China in the 70s. President George W. Bush, who I worked for, was a Harvard Business School student when his dad was ambassador. He visited China in the summer in the late 1970s, rode his bicycle around Beijing. You know, he felt he had a sense of China that he learned from his own experiences. And his interaction with Chinese leaders, I remember his first meeting with Hu Jintao. One of the things President Bush would do to try to size up a leader that he was meeting with, he would say, what is it that keeps you awake? Try to get to understand you a little better. What are you most worried about? And President Bush would confide that for him, it was another terrorist attack on U.S. soil after 9/11. That kept him up at night. You know, that's the kind of thing he was really focused on. And President Hu Jintao said, and this is in President Bush's book, so I'm not revealing state secrets. He said, in response to what keeps you awake at night, he said, I have to create, President Hu said, 25 million new jobs. I have to keep college graduates employed and keep Chinese citizens employed. And in a sense, President Bush said, well, he's not focused on external, he's focused on internal. And as long as China's focused on dealing with its challenges at home, maybe don't have as big a challenge in terms of China's challenge and China's policies abroad. But President Bush felt very strongly that we should try our best to build a constructive and positive relationship with China, recognizing that may not work out. And I was telling Chao Bing and Cho Bing on the way over here, when I became the China director, I was also given the additional duty of being the White House rep to the six-party talks, the nuclear negotiation. And one of the reasons that made sense at the time for the China director instead of the Korea director is because it was an important strategic issue that the U.S. and China were working together on. President Bush felt if we could make progress on this together in a way that benefited China and the U.S. and the region, then this would be good for U.S.-China relations going forward. We did make some progress. We had some cooperation with China, but obviously it's still a problem today. The question about Obama in 2009, I left in June, but what I remember most, what I can tell you at the beginning of the Obama administration was a real effort to build cooperation with China on climate change, the Iran nuclear issue, and to continue with the North Korean nuclear issue. And that was really the emphasis in the first year. In fact, one of the criticisms you could make is that the Obama administration prevented dealing with some of the more contentious issues because they were trying to build cooperation. There was some internal who were saying we shouldn't do that. We should both confront China on our challenges and try to cooperate. But there was a real effort. I do remember at the end of that first year some dissatisfaction with China's cooperation on those three issues. After Obama left China, you'll remember, he met with the Dalai Lama. He did an arms sales to Taiwan. And then the relationship, began to go, appear some friction. That's what I remember about it. If the visit was cool in 2009, November 2009, it may have been because the Obama White House was probably pushing for some real significant deliverables to show that the US and China can work together. And I'll tell you one inside baseball story. When I was in the early days of the Obama administration, the Chinese foreign minister came to the White House, foreign ministry, said they wanted to define or label the US-China relationship strategic partnership. And what we said is we're interested in partnering with you on strategic issues, North Korea, Iran, other issues. But we can't call ourselves strategic partners now because we're really not. We haven't really developed that track record of making progress together. But once we do, and we can show the world, then we can use that definition. But if we were to use it now, it would open us up to political criticism here in the United States for being, again, naive. So if you look at the first statement when President Obama and Hu Jintao met in London in April of the G20, there's a line in there that says US and China are increasingly looking for opportunities to partner on strategic issues. That was like compromised, right? So I tell you that story to give you a sense of where the Obama administration was in the first year, really wanting to develop this cooperation. I think the coolness was probably that they didn't have much to announce when President Obama went over there. There was no interest in a G2. Why no interest? Frankly, because of our friends in Northeast Asia. What signal does that send to U.S. alliance relationships? If there's a G2 in China, it undercuts those relationships. It undercuts at that time, our growing partnerships in ASEAN, Southeast Asia. So we were not interested in a G2. And we talked over lunch about the new type of major power relationships worldwide. There was not much interested in that. In large part, one of the main reasons was because of the signal that it would send to other friends and allies in the region, which are very important, not just for our Asia policy, but for China as well. Last question that you had was on the role of history. I mean, that's a very, very good question. It's my sense that, the Chinese experts and scholars will certainly rely on history in their encounters with the West. What I think clearly there is an effort over time to learn from countries and to adopt best practices within China. And we've seen that. And I suspect, I guess, from a US perspective, at some points along the way, we thought maybe that meant that there would be more convergence between us. But in a sense, it's, I think, has been, in my experience, more of an effort to adopt best practices, but to allow China to evolve in the unique way that it does. It is a very unique place, political system, and all the rest. And I think there is a real effort to look at history, to look at other countries and how they do things, and adopt best practices. Ultimately, it is to be a part of China's approach going forward that is very unique, very different. It's not clearly one of the things I hear from Chinese scholars quite often is, we're not looking to build a political system, an economic system that looks like yours. For a long time, they were looking at Singapore as a model that could be used, a governance model, and all the rest. I think they've integrated the things that they want to integrate, but there's things they're not interested in and not interested in. So it's not a great answer to your question, but thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Paul, for such illuminating presentation and also very comprehensive response to both Dr. Mahmood and also James. I like them so much that I can't help but have not one but two questions. The two questions are both about the policy ends and means of US involving China policy. First one on ends and the second one on the means. So about the ends, I think you're very candid and you are very nuanced in guiding us, showing that the US China policy from the Bush administration through Obama, Trump, and then Biden, it's a matter of departing from the earlier policy ends of shaping China's policy choices to something that you describe as you are using the institutions and emphasizing about the norms and rules of game, rules of international system to shape the interaction between the US and China. I think most in Southeast Asia wouldn't dispute that. I think we agree very much. But from Southeast Asia's perspective, since you are inviting a perspective from the nation of Southeast Asia, is that I think from a perspective within the countries, and I do think that Southeast Asia is not alone, we also see there are two other drivers of a US-China policy. In fact, it started, I would say, some say that it was very strong during Trump's era, getting even stronger with Biden. And the two separate driver is one of the structural, the other one of the domestic. Structural in the sense that many of us actually see that in addition to the reasons that you so correctly and very accurately described, there is also a structural consideration of preserving US primacy. And that seems to be the main driver as we see more and more evidence from Washington, D.C. So of course, it's not just about the structural ends and structural objective. It's about, the matter of how the number one in the system will try to enjoy the number one moment for as long as possible. But more importantly, and that was so clear even 2 days ago, during President Biden's address of the Union speech, that came so clear that it reminds me of what Tom Christensen said using towards useful adversaries. And that shows the domestic policy ends, right? So it has come to a stage where US, no matter who is really in White House, are trying to use the China and China-related issues to actually as a rallying point for domestic mobilization. And that was very much what Tom Christensen described in the first decade of Cold War period. And now it seems like we are entering into that stage when Biden emphasized that this is something that clearly we can unite the United States, bipartisan for sure. So those are policy ends that very much we in Southeast Asia, perhaps elsewhere, are seeing. That matters because I think it will affect how we are going to respond to US policy, which brings me to the second question about the means. And again, I think if I complete your excellent presentation, again, you were very candid by saying that, no, I don't think what is going on is containment. It's not about containing China. But very quickly, you also candidly say that, but yeah, maybe in some areas, and that was the words, in some areas, there are some elements of containment. So I wonder if you can elaborate what other areas, because so I mean, from our perspective, we are seeing the economic decoupling is certainly one so-called economic evidence of economic containment. And the Chip-4 alliance in supply chain sector becomes so clear that we saw that more and more countries are being entrapped into this kind of so-called economic decoupling, but perhaps serving strategy or even political purposes. Just two questions.
Well, no surprise, those are terrific questions. I know you are very steeped on these issues, and so I appreciate the question, Jeffrey. So, Tom Christensen was both my professor and my colleague. When I was the China director, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the China State Department. So, he's a terrific scholar and he was a practitioner as he was serving government. So, in terms of, let me respond to your question about useful adversaries. The idea that it's very useful for the United States to kind of play up the China threat because it can get legislation through and it can be used to sort of build American idea that the overriding goal is preserving this primacy by saying that one of the current conditions of U.S.-China relationship is what I call dueling narratives, okay, between China and between the United States about what's going on in the U.S.-China relationship and why the U.S.-China relationship has experienced this deterioration. Why has it evolved in such miserable ways over the last several years, right? And you hear very different narratives. I spent 10 years in China. I hear them all the time. I know them very well. I know the Chinese narratives. And I know in Southeast Asia and other places, I hear similar kind of descriptions. What you hear in China is that there's a tendency, I think, to attribute the downturn in U.S.-China relations primarily to the idea of a Thucydides trap. And this is Graham Allison at Harvard Kennedy School. The idea that U.S.-China tensions are the inevitable result of the changing balance of power in the international system. Graham Allison's assertion that this is a natural result of diminishing U.S. power and rising Chinese power. And that what's happening is the U.S. seeing China rise, getting worried, getting anxious about its own place as the established, as the established power, as the leading, the dominating power. And that because it's worried about China's rise, it's mobilizing to block and contain China's rise. Chinese scholars will make this argument, say, it's simply the fact that we're growing more powerful and more influential. Not about Chinese policies. It's not about changes to China's approach in the world, or about a more aggressive one. It's just simply because China is becoming more powerful. And the U.S. is now overreacting to China's growing influence, and that U.S. policies now are clearly an effort to keep China down. And for this reason, Chinese officials and scholars will tend to put the blame on the U.S. squarely on the United States for the deterioration of the relationship, and will call on the Biden administration to untie the knot that it has created, right? It will not surprise you, I don't agree with this, right? It may be a part of it. I agree with you. There are domestic dimensions to it, as you rightly point out. Certainly there's, it is the one issue on Capitol Hill where it's bipartisanism, right? But I would argue that's more because China is changing and the threat is real. And I don't think it's about preserving this primacy primarily. The narrative you heard from me is the reassessment of China has more to do with the worrisome trends that we see coming out of China, both domestic and foreign policy, and that those have led to a reassessment in the United States by both Democrats and Republicans. And you see that reassessment in other parts of the world too. In Asia, countries in Asia growing worried about China. Certainly they want to continue to work with China in areas where it's beneficial trade, but a real concern in other areas. And kind of an uncertain, not knowing how to deal with both the challenges, but with the things that they want to continue to develop with China. So U.S. officials, scholars will tend to look at China as a country whose policies have evolved, and that the changes in the U.S. approach to China are primarily around those and less about some Thucydides trap. I love Graham Allison. He's a terrific scholar, and I think his book has a lot of really interesting aspects. I don't know that he realizes how it's being used, frankly, by Chinese scholars, in a sense, because that argument relieves Chinese leaders of any contributions to the deterioration of the relationship. They say it's not about our policies, it's simply because we're going to policy. So I don't buy that. I think that in your second question, Chun-Tri, on the means, clearly there's some areas where it may look more like containment. And as I said, on semiconductors, it's an area where clearly the administration says, we're trying to slow down China's advancement in the most advanced semiconductors. National security concerns. And by the way, we haven't even talked about the balloon. But what's very interesting about the balloon is apparently within the balloon, they have identified US components being used in the surveillance equipment. Now, that's interesting, but it reinforces, in a sense, the concern, right? That US technology going to China is then turned around and used in a military sense or intelligence sense to undermine US national security. You'll hear more about this, I guarantee you. And that, in a way, demonstrates very concretely what the concerns about semiconductors are. Right? If China's able to advance on semiconductors, then they'll have they'll be able to enhance their military capabilities, thinking about scenarios going against the United States. And that's very worrisome. And so I think on the technology space, advanced computing is an area that I think you're going to see, in addition to semiconductors, artificial intelligence, even like clean technology is another area. So we've seen semiconductors, and I think we'll probably see other areas now come out and attempt to prevent China from advancing in those areas, certainly faster than the States.
Which are the 2 or 3 most likely sectors beyond semiconductor and others?
I think on that, you mentioned economic decoupling. I think that in this, I think, as I mentioned before, I think you're going to continue to see quite a bit of, engagement. U.S. companies, if you look, for example, at the American Chamber of Commerce surveys or U.S.-China Business Council surveys that come out, which survey sentiments of U.S. CEOs, what you hear, I think, generally is a concern about the U.S.-China relationship and the impact that that'll have, concern about policies that China has that we favor Chinese companies over their own companies. But generally, especially on the consumer side, the retail side, U.S. companies are doing very well, and would like to stay there if they can. So they're not looking to necessarily decouple. Companies that are in the more sensitive technology space, it's going to be much harder for those companies. Some of our companies, frankly, China decoupled from the US before the US decoupled from China by not allowing our internet platform companies into China. China said, no, we're not interested in that because of content concerns and wanting to develop their own Alibabas and Tencents and all the rest, right? So never been a very good market for US companies in that space, primarily because China blocked them, right? But I think other companies that have technology related aspects are going to find it more and more difficult. But some companies will continue to try to invest. Apple, for example, it's looking at supply chains elsewhere, but it's still doing quite a bit in China. I think they do so for as long as it can.
Yeah, Dr. Hu, I think we have quite a lot of questions from our Zoom audience as well. So yeah, can we get a few questions from our online audience, please?
So there are 5 askers and maybe about 7 or 8 questions. So I'm trying to highlight them as succinct as possible. Firstly, from Lee Hock Chai from a local law firm. So he thank you for your good presentation. And what's your take on the recent replacement of wolf warrior diplomats like Zhao Lijian, and also with the appointment of Qin Gang as the new foreign minister? Does that reflect a change of perspective of the United States, and would that mean China would be less confrontational? So this is the first set. Secondly, we have Chen Yifan. The questions, I think also Dr. Niang can also address that. So will Southeast Asia, in your opinion, being neutral between China and the United States in the coming years? So thirdly, I think just very short one, can the United States reduce its mistrust with China in the future. Something akin to the Nixon era, where US working really hard on improving relations with China. That's all for the first round.
Thank you for the questions about Southeast Asia's whether it will remain neutral. I think we will remain neutral as long as possible for all 10 Southeast Asian countries. However, I think the question is, are we pertinent when there is actually a real war that happened, and we have to think about what is the scenario of the war. And it's very difficult. Is it a Taiwan scenario? Is it a South China scenario, and so on and so forth? And depending on the nature of the particular conflict, certain countries will of course choose one side over the others. Anyway, I think if there's something that's going to happen like this, ASEAN probably to either stick together or you actually splinter into different parties and posts. So that will be very unfortunate for Southeast Asia.
So my questions that were the wolf warrior. It's interesting. We have seen recently, I think, an effort by China, the Chinese leadership, to project a more friendly approach to the U.S. Qin Gang wrote a very nice op-ed as he was leaving the United States to become foreign minister about the importance of U.S.-China and his efforts to work on that. And I think that's appreciated. Zhao Lijian was laterally moved to work on border issues, and he has been kind of a poster child for the wolf warriors, especially around COVID related a range of issues. So, I think most analysts I know see that as part of what seems to be an effort to try to put U.S.-China relations on better footing. In large part, probably so that it can deal with some of the challenges that frankly China has to deal with at home, getting out of COVID, getting the economy back up and running, a range of other issues. But I think those changes are positive. I mean, they still have the wolf warriors. I saw the Chinese ambassador in France yesterday had a lot to say about the balloon, which is, I didn't agree with much of it. And so they're still there. And I think the overall idea, which we heard, in the 2040 Congress, in terms of, the international environment and China preparing for, greater tensions with the United States and without mentioning the United States, but the idea of, looking to having a fighting spirit. Right? I think that's still there. It hasn't gone away, per se, but certainly there's been some tactical movements. I think in the near term, which is why, again, the balloon incident is unfortunate, right? Because the visit by Blinken then, was postponed, and I don't know whether it's going to be able to be rescheduled because the two sides still have very different narratives on it. It doesn't look like they're moving to any kind of resolution on it. We've got the two meetings coming up in March in China. That'll create calendar problems. So it is unfortunate because there were some steps like this wolf warrior rather cooling down that were helpful in terms of putting the relationship on better footing. In terms of the question around reducing mistrust, again, I think one of my worries about the balloon incident is that for many years we would hear that the views and perceptions of China in Washington, D.C. were becoming very, there was heightened concern. There was a debate in Washington, D.C. moving to a much tougher policy. But people would say, when you go to the heartland of America, at the subnational level, you still see the desire to interact with China, certainly on a trade, economic basis, and don't get the same kind of, really heightened concerns about China that you see in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, what the balloon incident does, in a sense, is it kind of brings the China threat to the heart. You go outside of it, you want to look up and see a Chinese surveillance balloon. That'll have an impact on kind of the American law chain, right? The American common citizens, right? And it's in the news, China's spying on us and surveillance. That's pretty clear, by the way. The notion that it was a weather balloon, I think there'll be probably some data or some information that comes out that makes that very, very clear. So that's the problem with the balloon incident. It makes the mistrust and the concerns even more serious. I think to build, greater trust is part of what I think these principles and operating mechanisms, developing with China, despite all the differences, despite the low levels of trust, trying to build in operating mechanisms and principles to manage the relationship built on common goals and common views and common assumptions. And that's going to be hard to do. But when Biden met with Xi and Bao, they talked about it. And then they sent Assistant Secretary level delegation to Beijing in December to begin conversations about that. And that, over time, that I think is going to become more important, especially as the areas of tension and disagreement continue to grow.
Before we go to the second round, Dr. Nguyen, I'm just wondering whether you have anything to add about the replacement of Saudi as the
I think Mr. Zhao's target mainly are Western countries. We are not affected that much, but we are glad that if it's transferred to another department, will improve the relationship.
So a question from Li Jin. So they asked about, has China's financial statecraft in Southeast Asia play an important role in the competition between China and the United States? The other sets of question is quite sophisticated. So there are two. So firstly, there are scholars in China who thought that it was too soon for China to change its foreign policy from 韬光养晦 to 奋发有为. But at the same time, many polls have shown that the perception of neighboring countries toward China has been declining over the years, partially due to its economic slowdown. Do all these indicators will be managed to persuade China to tone down its aggressive foreign policy, given that the CCP has always been pragmatic and which always have a very clear focusing on achieving economic growth? Secondly, it's about to Dr. Haenle. Do you think there is a certain sentiments of yellow peril within Washington's policymaking circle? So they are citing a remark from U.S. Department of State member that described U.S.-China relations as a clash of civilization, in which, especially with a great power which is not Caucasian. So, to what extent the current U.S. foreign policy is driven by the aspiration to protect American exceptionalism and hegemony? So I think which was partially addressed in the Q&A session just now, but maybe just an overall view about it.
Because we have something on ourselves, whether not China's financial statecraft.
Taking in reverse order. I remember that comment by a policy planning official in the Trump administration about clash of civilization, especially with the power of Caucasian. And I, like many others, we discussed it. And I think that is the positive thing that came out of that, which is most everyone that I know and folks that are serving the Biden administration about that was outrageous and completely condemned it and said there's no place for that kind of talk. and it doesn't represent reality. I mean, I don't think there's a yellow peril in Washington policy-making circles. Certainly, we heard a lot of really unfortunate rhetoric during the Trump administration, especially around the coronavirus and the China virus, which is just gratuitously hostile and unnecessary. And I think it's important to know, if you think about the first 2 years of the Biden administration, there's no place for it. And I hope whatever happens in 2 years, we don't see it. It's also caused big problems in the United States with our Asian American community. And it's something that I think most of the folks that I have respect for and that I know that we're in government don't condone. Second question on how long waiting. I know a lot of experts, including regional here in Southeast, think that Xi Jinping's move to a much more aggressive foreign policy is a real strategic misstep. Because in a sense, you could argue it has awakened the world up to the potential threats that China represents. Even for countries who are favorably exposed to China, they see certain aspects of China's evolving policies and actions, ways that China is using its newfound power. Not that China has greater power than it it's how is China using it, I think that's probably concern. And part of the shift now may be that. I mean, to remember, Xi Jinping has just done a lot of interaction, having bilateral meetings around G20 and APEC, met with a lot of world leaders after a long period of isolation. And I think during COVID, I think China experienced some diplomatic setbacks. It's my own sense. And I think a number of countries, not just the United States, have hardened their policies or become more concerned about the way China is evolving. I also do, I think that the leadership understands the importance of economic growth to its continued leadership. When I lived in China, most Chinese citizens didn't involve themselves in politics. But the understanding was that the Chinese Communist Party would continue to move forward in improving their livelihoods, making their lives better. And a big part of that is economic growth. And so China slows down too much, it will create, I think, political problems for the leadership within China, but also abroad, because I think a lot of China's offering, in particular to the global south, is this notion that China is rising, our economy is getting stronger, and the more that it rises, the more you all benefit. I think that's part of the message to Southeast Asia. Xiaobing can tell me if I'm wrong. That as China rises, the rest of the region will rise. If China slows down too much, that value proposition, what happens to it, right? And I think then countries begin to look at China differently. So I think there's a big emphasis on trying to get the economy back on track. The challenge for this will be, how does the leadership implement the set of economic policies oriented toward common prosperity without slowing economic growth or negatively impacting economic growth? In other words, how does the Chinese leadership, not kill the goose that has been laying the golden eggs? And I think there is a risk that frankly could happen based on some of these new policies that we've seen. And the last question on financial statecraft and the role in the competition between the US and China, I think Xiaobing, I guess the question is, what role does China financial, economic, trade, statecraft in Southeast Asia play in the competition between the US and China? And I think, I think the US recognizes that countries in the region want to engage with China on an economic basis, trade, finance, investment, all the rest. I do sense that there are real concerns about certain aspects of China today, including territorial claims here in the South China Sea, other issues around Chinese influence. I think there's a range of concerns, but my sense is countries are trying their best to thread the needle, right? By continuing to develop in a positive way the things where they can benefit from China, but yet trying to avoid the negative impact that will come from the other areas. And clearly the US has heard countries in the region do not want to choose. They want to deal with China and also deal with the United States. And I think the Biden administration has been accommodating to that idea, not asking countries to choose. But do want to work with countries where there are challenges emerging from China.
Sorry, I missed the Southeast Asia part when I was listening to the question, so but now I get it. Well, I think almost all Southeast Asian countries count China as the largest trade partner. Investment wise, China is actually not that big. It's big, but compared to some other established countries, are actually not that big. But we will see continued China's influx of tourists, investors, or students. I think they will actually come in a big way. Economic engagement is always going to be there. But I think the key for us is not to, of course, you continue on there, but I think it's for Southeast Asia is we want diversification. Many partners, not to say that we don't welcome China, but others, we don't want to exclusively just have China as one single partner. I think the more that we can gather, I think the better.
Shall we invite maybe one or two more questions from the floor? Yes.
My name is Zhou Chen. I'm from China mainland. Currently, I study at ICS-EAIR study here. And you mentioned many times the balloon problem. I think maybe from China officially and that this officially is that. But everybody in everybody's part have their own answers. And like you say, so maybe it's a surveillance balloon. And I think the surveillance behavior between countries is very common. Maybe this time is the balloon, and next time is US to China also the same. So many detective equipment surrounding China every day. So I think when two countries in good relations can solve this problem very low profile. But this time, at the US side, no, there is a balloon, and the US broadcast this problem to globally, but very strictly, very loudly. So I think this is a channel of propaganda, and propaganda and never propaganda only, I think, because propaganda is prepared for some real actions. And just like we read some news from the from the network saying some US generals from Pentagon saying US is preparing the war with China at 2025. I just read the news on the network. And the general's name is Michael something. And so I think because in every country, from China side, country is not an individual. Country is a very complex identities. Like in China, I think from China side, China don't have the ability to complete because China's growth is benefit from peaceful environment. But from US side, US, I don't think so. I don't that's my own opinion. US some interest group is benefit from peaceful environment. But in US, some interest group is benefited from conflict. So I think maybe there is a high risk between US and China have the possibilities to compete. My question is, what's your opinion or what's your view? Do you think inside US, the peaceful group is stronger or the competition group is more stronger? Because it's a different interest group. Which group is more stronger?
So a couple things on this. I think there's a variety of views. I'm not sure how I would characterize. What I can tell you is that the Secretary of State Blinken was very clear once the balloon emerged in U.S. national airspace. That's really when the problem is. It was over Billings, Montana. American citizens and residents could go outside and look up and see the balloon. So I don't know that the U.S. broadcast it globally. I think the balloon probably malfunctioned, is my sense, because those balloons operate actually atmospheric. They actually fly above where civilian aircraft fly normally. And my understanding is China has flown these balloons over 40 plus countries in the world. And a lot of countries now saying, oh, we saw Chinese balloons too. So it's like a Me Too movement. Balloons. But I think it was a mistake. I think it had a malfunction, came into U.S. national airspace, which is a violation of sovereignty of the United States of America. You just have to call it as it is, right? And what's interesting is, I know in China, a foreign balloon has actually come into Chinese airspace. And you know what they did to it? The PLA Air Force shot it out of the sky. Did exactly what the United States has done. There's a documentary, 2019 Chinese documentary, which goes through this example. Pilot was, rewarded as a hero of China for protecting, China's national security. So I don't think it's really surprising that the Biden administration, once the American people could see the balloon, they have an obligation to explain what it is and to be transparent and say, here's what it is, and here's what we think it is. And so, but Blinken came out at first, and I thought it was very constructive. He said, I would like to reschedule the visit when conditions allow. And the Chinese side was very constructive. Said they regretted the incident. They used the Chinese base behind, which is not normal for China to do, right? That's pretty significant, right? And they expressed understanding that the U.S. side would need to postpone the visit. So that was good at the beginning, but then subsequently, the rhetoric I've seen out of China has been much sharper, saying that the U.S., again, it's in a sense blaming the U.S. for overreacting, saying it's a weather balloon. In 1960, the United States was flying a U-2 spycraft over the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union shot it down. And the United States government under President Eisenhower said it was a weather aircraft monitoring weather. But shortly after, they came out and revealed that in fact it was a surveillance aircraft. And that was good because at the end of the day, it's an issue of trust, right? And I worry China is claiming this is a weather balloon and they're pulling all of this stuff out from the water. I think it's pretty clear that it's surveillance, and that will come out. So I hope that the narratives on both sides can find an off-ramp, right? Because if China continues, in my view, if they continue with the U.S. is overreactive, the U.S. is too sensitive, this was a weather balloon, and by the way, we're going to potentially shoot something out of the sky if it gets near China. The last point I want to make is I hear a lot of on Chinese Weibo about, well, the U.S. is flying surveillance aircraft along China's border. They have Navy ships that surveil in the economic, the EEZ, exclusive economic zone. And so, you know, the US does it too. It's very different, right? From a US perspective, those are international waters, international space, international areas, right? It's not, they're very different, and then they're not flying into Chinese sovereign territory. I know China doesn't like that. I understand that. But it's a different issue than the balloon falling down into US national airspace, which I think was justified in shooting it down. So I hope the two sides can figure out a way to pull the rhetoric down, use some creative points, and get to a better place, because that meeting is important for all the reasons we were talking about today, trying to find some stability during a period of time.
Time for maybe one more question.
My name is Min Ching. I'm a PhD student from the Faculty of Art and Social Science. And because I'm doing research focused on the Hong Kong relations with China. So I realized that since the Biden administration, and he quite emphasized about the human rights issues in China, including the Hong Kong people and the Uyghur people, etc. So my question is, how, from the United States perspective, what kind of roles that Hong Kong played in the China-US relations, and from the US perspective, how to consider about all these political events or the political crisis occurs in Hong Kong? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I think, unfortunately, the Hong Kong issue over the last few years has been a difficult issue in US-China. And the imposition of the national security law was not seen favorably in the United States. And this has been a point of contention. Right? It's one of several examples that I hear from US government officials about demonstrating where current Chinese leadership is becoming much more aggressive. Right? In fact, most did not anticipate that President Xi would impose the national security law, and were quite surprised when he did it. It was seen as quite bold and a significant step. But usually the way I hear it talked about in the US, because look, Hong Kong is a part of China, right? And so you can't dispute that, right? I think there was just a view that over the 50-year period after the return of Hong Kong, that Hong Kong would be able to enjoy more autonomy and not so quickly come under the direct control in terms of national security and other ways of China. But at the end of the day, it is part of China, right? But I hear people talk about Hong Kong and put in the same group of issues where the US and China have had differences, whether it's Xinjiang, as you mentioned, concerns about what China's doing with regard to contested areas along its border with India, China's stronger assertions of the territorial claims in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, just a general pattern of a much more aggressive, much more risk-tolerant approach by the current leadership, and that is worrying. And that then flows into concerns about what decisions might be made in China over Taiwan. And this good student over here mentioned General Minahan's, and I didn't comment on General Minahan's comments, which I think are not helpful, frankly, for a four-star Air Force general of Air Mobility Command to say that he thinks the US and China are going to go to war by 2025. That's not particularly helpful. And the Pentagon said they distanced themselves from those remarks. They said they don't endorse those remarks. But it does show that there is real concern about what decisions the Chinese leadership may make regarding Taiwan. my own view is that, I don't think the leadership has a timeline on Taiwan, where they're going to move to, try to reunify through force. I assume that Xi Jinping has told his military to be prepared in the event that a decision is made. And 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army. So, in setting a goal, that's a good timeline. The 100th anniversary, have the capability to invade Taiwan successfully in the event that I call on you to do that. I don't think that there's any decision to do that. I think what you're hearing from the United States is more a reflection of anxiety and concerns, given the more aggressive actions taken on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, India, South China Sea, that China that the leader may be so risk tolerant that he may decide, I need to do something now. Because as time goes by, the challenge becomes more difficult. So I think what you're seeing and hearing is these anxieties, concerns. And it all is part of, I think, frankly, a misunderstanding or I think an evaluation of who Xi Jinping was at the beginning of his leadership didn't turn out to be really right. I mean, I don't think anybody anticipated he would be this aggressive and this willing to bring on risk in the actions that he takes. I hope I answered.
Thank you, Carl. So with that, I think we have come to the end of our forum today. So just to sum up a little, I think we have basically achieved the objective of our session today, because we have heard from both our speaker and also discussant on various issues like the continuity and also changes in US-China relations since Bush administration. And then we also talk about Southeast Asian perspective on US-China relations, and some key questions on US foreign policy debate, and the fact that Prof. Haenle highlighted that the China we're dealing with today is very different from the China we're dealing with many decades ago. So with that, please join me in thanking Prof. Haenle for his excellent presentation today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. So have a good evening ahead. Thank you and bye-bye. Okay, now we proceed to the exchange ceremony.